The stamp came down wrong. Kurt Gerstein's hand froze over the transit document, the official seal slightly off-center, overlapping the typed text by 2 millimeters. In the silence of the Gestapo records room at 3:17 in the morning, that crooked stamp was a death sentence. His death sentence. For 5 full seconds he stared at the ruined form, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The document belonged to the Rosenblum family, 3 people scheduled for deportation to Treblinka in 9 hours. With the correct paperwork, they would instead board a train to Switzerland as essential workers, reassigned to a neutral zone factory. Without it, they would be corpses by nightfall. Gerstein had no more blank forms. The forgery had taken him 40 minutes of meticulous work, every stamp perfectly aligned, every signature precisely matched to the originals he had memorized from hundreds of documents. 1 form per family. 1 chance. He had just destroyed it. His hands began to shake. Not now, he thought savagely. Not after 647. Not after everything. The door at the end of the corridor creaked open. Gerstein's body went rigid. Night security made rounds every 30 minutes. He had timed his forgery sessions down to the second, knew exactly when Wachtmeister Holst would pass through this section. 23 minutes from now. Not now. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Not Holst's heavy, deliberate tread. These steps were quicker, lighter, purposeful. Someone who knew exactly where they were going. Gerstein swept the ruined document and the stamps into his briefcase in one smooth motion, closed the cabinet with a soft click, and stepped to the window. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass. SS uniform impeccable, face composed, the picture of an officer working late on important matters. Nothing in that reflection suggested a man whose pulse was racing at 140 beats per minute. The footsteps stopped outside the records room door. The handle turned. Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Krause stepped into the room, his pale eyes scanning the space before settling on Gerstein, with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been something much worse. Sturmbannführer, Krause said pleasantly. I did not expect to find anyone here at this hour. Gerstein turned from the window with the mild irritation of a man interrupted in his work. Krause. I could say the same. Insomnia. Paperwork, Krause replied, moving further into the room. His gaze drifted across the filing cabinets, the desk where Gerstein had been working moments before, the briefcase now sitting innocently closed. There are always discrepancies to investigate. Missing files, irregularities in transfer records. You understand how it is? I do, Gerstein said. Every word was a test. Every glance was a probe, searching for weakness. Which is why I am here at this ungodly hour, reviewing hygiene compliance reports instead of sleeping. The Reichsfuhrer wants an assessment of disinfection protocols by Friday. Krause nodded slowly. You are very dedicated, Sturmbannführer. Always working late. Always handling the details personally. The emphasis on that last word was so slight that another man might have missed it. Gerstein did not miss it. Someone has to, he replied evenly. If you will excuse me, Krause, these reports will not write themselves. For a long moment, Krause did not move. His eyes held Gerstein's, searching for something, weighing something. Then he smiled, a thin expression that touched his lips, but went nowhere near his eyes. Of course, he said. Good night, Sturmbannführer. He left the door open behind him. Gerstein waited, counting his breaths, listening to Krause's footsteps recede down the corridor. 10 seconds. 20. 30. gone, or waiting around the corner. Gerstein closed his briefcase, gathered his papers, and walked out of the records room with measured, unhurried steps. A man finishing his work for the night, a man with nothing to hide. In his apartment 2 hours later, with the blackout curtains drawn and a single lamp burning, Gerstein opened his briefcase and stared at the ruined document. The Rosenblum family would be at the deportation assembly point in 7 hours. Without the forged papers, they had no escape. He had one blank form left. He had been saving it for an emergency, hidden in a false bottom of his desk at home. One form, one family, one more chance to get the stamp exactly right. His hands were still shaking. Gerstein poured himself 3 fingers of schnapps, drank it in one swallow, and got to work. 18 months earlier, Kurt Gerstein had been a different man. August 17th, 1942. The date was burned into his memory with the precision of trauma. He had traveled to Belzec extermination camp as part of his official duties with the SS Hygiene Institute, tasked with evaluating disinfection procedures, technical assessment, process efficiency, bureaucratic language for industrial murder. The train from Luau arrived at 11 in the morning carrying 3,000 people. Gerstein watched from the platform as the boxcar doors opened, as guards screamed orders, as families stumbled out into the summer heat, still believing they were being relocated for work assignments. 45 boxcars, 1,450 already dead from suffocation and heat before the doors even opened. Their bodies were dragged out and stacked like cordwood, while the living were herded toward the processing area. Gerstein stood next to Hauptmann Christian Wirth, the commandant, who narrated the procedure with the casual pride of a factory foreman explaining an assembly line. Here, the victims surrendered their belongings. Here, their hair was cut for industrial use. Here they undressed and were driven naked down a corridor lined with flowers and reassuring signs, promising showers and delousing. The gas chambers were disguised as bathhouses, each chamber designed to hold 750 people. 4 chambers total. The doors were thick and sealed. Gerstein watched as guards packed the first chamber beyond capacity, people crushed together so tightly they could not fall even when they died. He heard the screams when they realized what was happening. He saw a woman of about 40, her eyes blazing, call down curses on the heads of the murderers. He watched Hauptmann Wirth strike her across the face with his riding whip 5 times, 6 times, before she was shoved into the chamber with the others. The diesel engine that supplied the carbon monoxide failed to start. Mechanical problem. 2 hours and 49 minutes the people inside that sealed chamber waited to die, screaming, praying, suffocating in the packed heat and darkness. Gerstein stood outside, listening. Hauptmann Wirth checked his watch and made jokes about diesel reliability. When the engine finally started, it took another 32 minutes for everyone inside to die. The doors opened. Bodies were removed by Jewish work details, who would themselves be murdered in weeks. Gold teeth were extracted. The chambers were cleaned. The next transport was already arriving. That night, in his quarters, Kurt Gerstein vomited until his throat bled. Then he sat in the dark with his service pistol in his hand, the barrel cold against his temple, his finger on the trigger. He thought about his wife, Elfriede. He thought about his 2 children. He thought about the 3,000 people he had watched murdered that day, and the thousands more who would follow tomorrow, and the day after, and every day, until this machine of death consumed everyone in its path. One bullet, one trigger pull, one escape from the knowledge that he was now complicit in the worst crime in human history. But suicide was an act of cowardice. Suicide changed nothing. The machine would continue without him. Unless the idea formed slowly in the darkness of that room, crystallizing with the cold logic of desperation. One man could not stop the machine. But one man inside the machine, positioned correctly, with access and authority, and the willingness to use both, could save individuals. Not everyone. Never everyone. But some. Some was better than none. Gerstein put the pistol down. He had found his purpose. His first act of sabotage came 3 weeks later. A shipment of Zyklon B poison gas, requisitioned for use at Auschwitz, somehow became contaminated during transport and had to be destroyed. A clerical error in the paperwork. These things happened in wartime. The delay cost the SS 3 weeks of killing capacity. 3 weeks meant thousands of lives extended, if not saved. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was a beginning. On a train from Warsaw to Berlin in late August 1942, Gerstein engineered a chance encounter with Swedish diplomat Baron Göran von Otter. Not chance at all. Gerstein had studied diplomatic travel schedules for weeks, positioned himself in the correct train car, created the circumstances for conversation. For 6 hours, as the Polish countryside rolled past outside the window, Gerstein told von Otter everything. Belzec, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the diesel engines, the 3,000 dead in a single morning, the systematic murder of an entire people. He spoke in a quiet, level voice, as if discussing routine military logistics. But his hands shook as he held his coffee cup. Von Otter listened, his face growing paler with each detail. When Gerstein finished, the diplomat sat in silence for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" Von Otter finally asked. "Because the world must know," Gerstein replied. "Because I cannot stop this alone. Because when the war ends and the trials come, I need someone who can testify that not everyone who wore this uniform was a monster. And because I need help from the outside to make what I do from the inside matter." It was a calculated risk. Von Otter could have reported him immediately. Instead, the Swedish diplomat became Gerstein's lifeline to Allied intelligence, passing information, confirming identities, helping coordinate escapes across neutral borders. But intelligence gathering was not enough. Information did not save the people being loaded into boxcars every morning. Gerstein needed to act directly. His position in the SS Hygiene Institute gave him access to the entire bureaucratic apparatus of the Reich. Requisition forms, transfer orders, travel permits, identity documents. The Nazis ran their empire of death on paperwork, and Gerstein had learned every form, every stamp, every signature that could mean the difference between life and death. He started with one family. The Goldsteins, a doctor and his wife and teenage daughter, scheduled for deportation. Gerstein created transfer papers showing they had been reassigned to a military hospital in Bavaria as essential medical personnel. The documents were perfect. No one questioned them. The Goldsteins reached Switzerland 3 weeks later. One family, 3 lives. Gerstein did it again, and again, and again. He recruited carefully. A secretary in the records department, whose Jewish fiancé had died at Dachau, a train dispatcher, who could be bribed, a forger, who worked for the resistance and needed protection. Each person knew only their small piece of the operation, never the full picture. By night, Gerstein worked in empty offices, using copied keys to access locked cabinets. He forged signatures he had memorized from studying files for months. He used official stamps with the precision of a surgeon. Every document had to be perfect. One mistake would unravel everything. By day, he was Sturmbannführer Kurt Gerstein, exemplary SS officer. He attended meetings. He filed reports on Zyklon B efficiency while knowing exactly what that efficiency meant in human lives. He socialized with colleagues who joked about killing quotas over schnapps. He shook hands with men whose orders had murdered tens of thousands. The psychological cost was immense. There were operations he could not stop, transports he knew about, but lacked the access or time to disrupt. People who died because saving them would have exposed his network and ended his ability to save anyone else. Those nights, alone with a bottle and his thoughts, Gerstein calculated the mathematics of morality. 647 lives saved. How many thousands had died while he stood by, silent, complicit? The equation never balanced, but he kept working. Because some was better than none. Because stopping would mean every life he could have saved became another death on his conscience. And now, at 4:37 in the morning, on March 24th, 1943, with Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Krause circling closer and 647 lives in the balance, Kurt Gerstein bent over his desk and forged one more document. His hands were steady now. The stamp came down perfect. The Rosenblum family made it to the platform at Anhalter Station with 11 minutes to spare. Gerstein watched from across the concourse, positioned behind a newspaper kiosk, where he could observe without being seen. His heart hammered against his ribs as he tracked their movement through the crowd. 3 people, a mother and father in their 50s, their adult son walking between them with a noticeable limp from childhood polio. Each of them carried a single, small suitcase. Each of them wore the yellow star on their coats, marking them as targets for any zealous Nazi who might question why Jews were boarding a civilian train instead of a deportation transport. Gerstein had given them the forged documents 4 hours ago in a pre-dawn meeting in the basement of a bombed-out building in Kreuzberg. Transit permits, stamped with the eagle and swastika. Work assignment papers, showing they were being transferred to a munitions factory in Zurich as technical specialists. Travel authorizations signed by an Obersturmbannführer who did not exist. The documents were perfect. Gerstein had remade them 3 times after destroying the first attempt, working through the night until his vision blurred and his hands cramped. Every letter aligned precisely, every stamp positioned exactly where it should be. But perfect documents meant nothing if the Rosenblums panicked at a checkpoint. The father approached the ticket control booth. Gerstein could not hear the conversation from this distance, but he watched the body language with the intensity of a man whose life depended on reading every gesture. The father's hand, as he passed the documents to the inspector, steady or shaking. The inspector's face as he examined the papers, routine boredom or suspicious scrutiny. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. The inspector stamped the documents and waved them through. Gerstein exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. The Rosenblums disappeared into the crowd, moving toward Platform 7. In 20 minutes, their train would depart for Frankfurt, then Basel, then across the border into Switzerland. In 48 hours, they would be free. 648, 49, 50. Gerstein turned to leave the station and walked directly into Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Krause. "Sturmbannführer Gerstein," Krause said, his pale eyes bright with interest. "What a coincidence to find you here. I would not have taken you for a railway enthusiast." Every muscle in Gerstein's body screamed at him to run. Instead, he smiled with exactly the right blend of surprise and mild annoyance at the interruption. "Krause," he said evenly, "I am meeting someone, a contact from the Health Ministry regarding supply requisitions. Bureaucracy waits for no man, not even on a Saturday morning." Krause's gaze drifted past Gerstein toward the platforms, then back. "Of course," he said pleasantly, "though I confess I find it curious that your meeting would take place at a train station rather than an office." "My contact is arriving from Munich," Gerstein replied without hesitation. It seemed more efficient to meet him here rather than make him navigate Berlin on his first visit. It was a good lie, constructed in the 2 seconds it took Krause to finish his sentence. Plausible, logical, easily verifiable if Krause bothered to check, and equally easy to explain away if the supposed contact never appeared. Krause nodded slowly. "I hope your meeting proves productive," he said. "Good day, Sturmbannführer." He walked away toward the main exit. Gerstein waited exactly 30 seconds, counting silently, before moving in the opposite direction. He did not look back to see if Krause was watching. Looking back would suggest he had something to hide. On platform 7, the train to Frankfurt was pulling out of the station. Gerstein allowed himself the briefest flicker of satisfaction. Then he left the station through a side entrance and walked 4 blocks before catching a tram in a direction that had nothing to do with his actual destination. Krause was circling. The encounter at the station was not coincidence. The Gestapo officer was testing him, probing for reactions, building a case from small inconsistencies that would eventually accumulate into evidence. Gerstein needed to be more careful, or he needed to be more bold. 3 days later, he chose bold. The list arrived on his desk at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier from Gestapo headquarters, with a cover memo requesting SS Hygiene Institute review for medical concerns. Standard procedure for large-scale deportations. Identify anyone with contagious diseases who might need to be separated from the general transport to prevent epidemics that could interfere with the efficient processing of arrivals. Bureaucratic language for deciding who would die slightly slower than the others. Gerstein opened the file. 218 names, men, women, children, all scheduled for deportation to Auschwitz in 6 days. He read through the list once, committing every name to memory. Then he read it again, this time identifying possibilities. Who had skills that could be falsely documented as essential? Who had family connections that could be manufactured into bureaucratic complications? Who could be made to disappear into the paperwork maze of the Reich before they ever reached the trains? 43 names stood out as viable candidates for rescue. 43 was impossible. The system could absorb the loss of individuals without noticing. A family here, a pair there, statistical noise in the chaos of millions being moved through the machinery of genocide. But 43 people vanishing from a single transport would trigger immediate investigation. Gerstein made marks next to 11 names. 11 was still dangerously high, but 11 might slip through if the documentation was perfect and the timing was precise. He hated the mathematics, hated choosing who lived and who died based on the calculus of what his network could handle without exposure. Every name he did not mark was a person he was condemning to death, as surely as if he had pushed them into the gas chamber himself. But saving 11 meant he could continue the work. Trying to save all 43 meant discovery, execution, and the end of any future rescues. Some was better than none. The equation never stopped being obscene. That night, Gerstein met with his core network in the cellar of a bakery in Wedding. 4 people besides himself, each one a piece of the machinery he had assembled over 18 months of careful recruitment. Margaret Klein, the records clerk at Gestapo headquarters, whose fiancé had been murdered at Dachau. She could access files, alter entries, create bureaucratic fog that lasted just long enough for people to slip through. Hans Miller, the train dispatcher at Grunewald Station, who controlled the rail schedules and could redirect transports or lose individual passengers in the chaos of wartime railway operations. Father Bernhard Lichtenberg, an elderly Catholic priest who ran an underground network moving people out of Berlin to safe houses in the countryside, and from there to neutral borders. He had already been arrested twice and released twice due to lack of evidence and fear of creating a martyr. And Dieter Hauptmann, a forger who worked for the communist resistance and needed Gerstein's protection from SD surveillance in exchange for his skills with documents. Gerstein spread the list across the table under the light of a single dim bulb. 11 people, he said quietly. 6 days. Margaret studied the names. This is more than we have ever attempted at once, she said. More risk. More lives, Gerstein replied. Or more deaths when we are caught, Muller said. His hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette. Every operation increases the chance of exposure. You know this. Gerstein knew. The mathematics of risk were as brutal as the mathematics of choosing who to save. Every forgery, every altered document, every person pulled from the system created another data point that the SD could eventually connect into a pattern. But the alternative was doing nothing. And doing nothing, while possessing the ability to act, was a choice Gerstein had rejected the night he put down his pistol at Belzec. We proceed, he said. Margaret, you will need to access the deportation roster and create processing delays for these individuals. Medical holds, clerical errors, anything that keeps them off the transport without raising immediate flags. Hans, once they are separated from the main group, we need them on civilian rail, not military transports. Dieter, I need travel documents and work authorizations for all 11, different destinations, different cover stories. Father, Gerstein turned to Lichtenberg, your network will need to receive 11 people over 2 days and move them out of Berlin within 48 hours. Can your people handle that volume? The priest's weathered face was grave. We can try, he said slowly. Though I must tell you, Sturmbannführer, that the Gestapo has been watching several of my churches more closely in recent weeks. If they are building a case against me, bringing 11 Jews through my network in 2 days might provide them the evidence they need. They are always building cases, Gerstein said. The question is whether we act despite the risk or abandon people to death, because we fear for our own safety. It was unfair, and he knew it. These people had risked everything already, saved hundreds at the potential cost of their own lives. But Gerstein also knew that moral clarity in war required a certain ruthlessness, even toward allies. Father Lichtenberg met his eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded. "We will do it," he said quietly. "God forgive us if we fail." The operation began 36 hours later. Margaret created medical holds on 5 of the 11 names, flagging them for tuberculosis screening that would require isolation and testing before they could be cleared for transport. The other 6 were marked with bureaucratic complications, duplicate registrations that needed to be resolved, address discrepancies that required investigation, standard administrative chaos. Nothing that would seem suspicious on its own, but enough to separate them from the main deportation group for 72 hours. In that 72-hour window, Gerstein's network moved. Hans Müller arranged for the isolated individuals to be transferred to a temporary holding facility at Grunewald Station, officially for final documentation processing, before reassignment to the correct transport. Once at the station, they were quietly separated and provided with the forged civilian documents Dieter had created. The documents transformed them. No longer Jews scheduled for deportation. Now they were factory workers being relocated to essential war production facilities in neutral territories. Technical specialists whose skills were too valuable to waste. Father Lichtenberg's people picked them up in small groups, never more than 3 at once, and moved them to safe houses scattered across Berlin. From there, they would be smuggled out over the next week, traveling in pairs or alone to Switzerland, Sweden, or Spain, depending on which route seemed safest. It was working. And then it was not. On the 4th day, Margret failed to appear at the bakery for their scheduled meeting. Gerstein waited 30 minutes past the appointed time, his stomach knotting with each passing second. Margaret was never late. Never. Hans Müller arrived 20 minutes later, his face ashen. "She was arrested this morning," he said without preamble. "Gestapo came to her apartment at dawn. Kraus led the team personally." The world tilted. Gerstein gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "Does she know about this location?" he asked. Müller shook his head. "No one person knows all the safe houses. We agreed on that protocol from the beginning. But she knows names. She knows methods. If they break her, they will break her," Gerstein interrupted flatly. "Everyone breaks eventually. The question is how long she can hold out and what we do with the time she buys us." The mathematics had changed. Every hour Margaret resisted interrogation was an hour for the network to scatter, destroy evidence, create new cover stories. But every hour also brought Kraus closer to connecting the pattern. Gerstein made his decision. "Get the remaining people out tonight," he ordered. "All of them. Do not wait for the planned schedule. Father Lichtenberg, activate every route you have. Hans, I need you to disappear for 72 hours. Go to your sister's house in Leipzig, and do not contact anyone until I send word it is safe." "And you?" Müller asked. Gerstein stood. "I have a meeting with Hauptsturmführer Kraus," he said quietly. "It is time to find out exactly what he knows." Krause kept Gerstein waiting for 42 minutes. It was deliberate, Gerstein knew, a calculated display of power designed to increase anxiety and break down psychological defenses before the interrogation even began. Standard Gestapo technique. Let the suspect sit in silence, imagining what was coming, manufacturing their own terror more effectively than any threat could. Gerstein sat motionless in the hard wooden chair outside Krause's office, his hands resting calmly on his knees, his face composed. He had learned long ago that the key to surviving as a double agent was absolute control over visible emotion. Fear was natural, inevitable, but showing fear was suicide. He used the waiting time productively, running through his cover story, checking for inconsistencies, preparing responses to every question Krauss might ask. Where had he been on specific dates? What files had he accessed? Who had he met with, and why? Every answer had to be perfect, verifiable, but not too convenient, plausible, but not rehearsed. The door to Krauss's office opened. "Sturmbannführer Gerstein," Krauss said pleasantly. "Thank you for your patience. Please come in." The office was small and austere, dominated by a heavy desk covered with files. A single window looked out over Prince Albrecht Strasse, the spring sunlight filtering through thin curtains. 2 chairs faced the desk. Krauss gestured to one of them as he settled into his own seat, with the comfortable authority of a man on his home territory. Gerstein sat. Noted the positioning of the chairs, slightly lower than Krauss's, forcing the person being questioned to look up at their interrogator. Noted the files on the desk, too far away to read but positioned, so he could see there were many of them. Noted the closed door behind him and the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Every detail was stagecraft. Krauss was building a psychological pressure chamber. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," Krauss began. "I know how busy you must be with your duties at the Hygiene Institute." "Not at all," Gerstein replied evenly. "I am always happy to assist the Gestapo in any way I can. What is this regarding?" Krauss opened one of the files. "Irregularities," he said simply. "Small things, really. The kind of administrative inconsistencies that probably mean nothing. But my job is to investigate even the small things, because sometimes small things connect into larger patterns." He looked up, his pale eyes meeting Gerstein's with an intensity that felt like a physical pressure. "You understand patterns, I think," Krauss continued. "As a scientist, you look for connections that others might miss." "I try," Gerstein said. His voice was calm, interested, the tone of a colleague engaged in professional discussion. Krauss nodded. "For example," he said, pulling a sheet of paper from the file, "over the past 14 months, approximately 237 individuals scheduled for deportation have been delayed, rerouted, or otherwise failed to arrive at their designated camps. 237. Out of hundreds of thousands processed through the system, this is statistically insignificant. Background noise." He paused, letting the number hang in the air between them. "But when I examine these cases more closely," Krauss continued, "I notice something interesting. A disproportionate number involve medical holds approved by the SS Hygiene Institute, transfer orders referencing health protocols, quarantine procedures that somehow result in individuals being moved to different transports and then disappearing from the records entirely." Gerstein's pulse spiked, but his expression remained neutral. "Medical holds are standard procedure," he said. "Typhus, tuberculosis, any number of contagious diseases require isolation to prevent epidemics in the camps. Surely the Gestapo does not consider disease control suspicious." "Of course not," Krauss agreed. "But I am curious about the pattern. When I cross-reference these medical holds with document access logs, I find that many of them were processed during late-night hours, when most staff had gone home. And the authorizing signatures, while technically correct, show minor variations from authenticated exemplars. Very minor. The kind of thing only an expert forger would notice. The trap was closing. Gerstein could feel it tightening around him with each word. Kraus had been building this case for months, accumulating evidence, waiting for enough pieces to create an undeniable pattern. "I work late frequently," Gerstein said. "The war does not respect office hours. As for signature variations, I would need to see the specific documents you are referencing. Minor inconsistencies in handwriting are common when officers are tired or working quickly." Kraus smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I thought you might say that," he said. He opened another file, this one thicker than the first. "Which is why I have spent considerable time interviewing personnel who work in the same building as you. Security guards, cleaning staff, people who notice things but are rarely asked what they have seen." He pulled out several typewritten pages. "Wachtmeister Holst reports encountering you in the records room at unusual hours on at least 7 occasions over the past 4 months. Each time, you explained you were working on reports. But when I checked the official work logs, there are no reports filed that would require access to deportation records." Gerstein's mind raced through possible explanations. Too detailed would sound rehearsed. Too vague would sound evasive. He needed something in between, plausible enough to create doubt without being obviously constructed. "I was conducting a study," he said, "tracking disease transmission patterns in pre-deportation populations. The Reichsfuhrer wanted data on whether holding facilities were contributing to epidemic spread. I accessed the records to compile statistics on medical conditions reported during processing. The study was never completed because the data proved inconclusive. It was a good lie. Verifiable in its general claims, but vague enough in specifics to be difficult to disprove." Kraus wrote something in his notes. "Interesting," he said. "I will need to verify that with your superiors. But that still does not explain the testimony of Frau Ulin Becker, the night cleaning supervisor. She reports seeing you at Anhalter Station on 3 separate occasions in the early morning hours. Once in March, once in April, twice in May. Always watching the platforms, always alone. She remembers because she takes the first train to work and noticed an SS officer behaving strangely. The walls were closing in. Each piece of evidence by itself was circumstantial, but together they formed a web that was becoming impossible to escape." "I have insomnia," Gerstein said, "since Belzec. Sometimes I walk at night to clear my head. The station is on my route. If I stopped to watch trains, it was simply because I found the routine comforting. There is nothing sinister about an officer dealing with the psychological strain of his duties in his own way." For the first time, Kraus's expression shifted. A flicker of something, not quite sympathy but perhaps understanding. "Belzec," he repeated quietly. "Yes, I read your report on that inspection. Very detailed, very technical. But between the lines, Sturmbannführer, I sensed a man who had seen something that disturbed him." He leaned forward slightly. "Which makes me wonder," Kraus continued, his voice dropping to almost conversational. "If a man was disturbed enough by what he witnessed, if he began to question whether the orders he was following served the Reich or betrayed it, if such a man decided to act on those doubts, what would that look like?" It was the most dangerous moment of the interrogation. Kraus was offering him an opening, a chance to confess in exchange for what? Understanding? Leniency? a quick death instead of a slow one. Or it was a trap, a way to get him to incriminate himself before the evidence was quite solid enough to bring charges. Gerstein held Krauss's gaze. "It would look like treason," he said flatly. "And I am not a traitor. I serve the Reich faithfully, even when that service requires me to witness things that no man should have to see. If you have evidence that suggests otherwise, Hauptsturmführer, I suggest you present it formally. Otherwise, this conversation is pointless and insulting." For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Krauss sat back in his chair. "You are right," he said. "I apologize if I have offended you. As I said, these are small inconsistencies, probably meaningless. I am simply being thorough." He closed the files. "Thank you for your time, Sturmbannführer. That will be all for now." Gerstein stood. "For now," he repeated. "Does that mean you will be calling me back?" Krause smiled. "Only if more inconsistencies appear," he said pleasantly. "I am sure they will not." It was a warning. Stop whatever you are doing, or the next interview will not be a conversation. Gerstein left the office and walked through Gestapo headquarters with measured steps, nodding to officers he passed, his face calm and professional. Only when he reached the street outside did he allow himself to breathe fully. Krauss knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not enough to arrest him yet, but enough to be watching closely. The next operation would need to be perfect, or it would be the last. That night, in the bakery cellar, Gerstein faced his network with the truth. "Krauss is building a case," he said without preamble. "He has patterns, witnesses, enough circumstantial evidence to justify deeper investigation. We have two choices. We can stop now, destroy evidence, scatter, and hope he loses interest. Or we can continue, knowing that every operation from this point forward carries exponentially higher risk." Hans Müller spoke first. "How many are scheduled for the next transport?" he asked quietly. Gerstein had been waiting for that question. 462, he said. "Day after tomorrow. Families. Children." Father Lichtenberg closed his eyes. "Then we continue," he said. "God placed us in this position for a reason. If we abandon his children to save ourselves, we are no better than the men we oppose." Dieter nodded slowly. "How many can we realistically save without triggering immediate investigation?" he asked. Gerstein had done the mathematics already. 15, he said. "Maybe 20 if we are very lucky and very careful. More than that, and Krauss will know immediately." 15 out of 462, Muller said bitterly. "The arithmetic of damnation." "The arithmetic of survival," Gerstein corrected. 15 more lives. 15 more reasons to continue. But even as he said it, he felt the weight of the 447 he would not save crushing down on him like a physical burden. 447 people who would die because he chose caution over courage. 447 souls added to the ledger he would carry for the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. Some was better than none, but some was also a knife that cut deeper every time he had to make the choice. The operation began the next morning. 15 names selected from 462, each one representing not just a life, but a family, a history, a future that would exist only because of documents forged in darkness and risks taken by people who had every reason to choose self-preservation over sacrifice. Margaret was gone, arrested, and very likely being tortured in the interrogation cells below Gestapo headquarters. where Krauss specialized in extracting confessions through methods that made suicide seem merciful. Without her access to the record system, Gerstein had to rely on alternative methods, riskier paths through the bureaucratic maze. He created the medical holds himself, forging authorization signatures with trembling hands that remembered every detail of Krauss's interrogation. One mistake, one misplaced letter, or slightly wrong pen pressure, and the forgery would be detected. Detection meant investigation. Investigation meant discovery of the entire network. The stamp came down. Perfect. Again. Perfect. 15 times. 15 perfect forgeries. 15 lives balanced on ink and paper. Hans Müller moved the isolated individuals to Grunewald Station, using transfer orders that existed only in Gerstein's fabricated reality. Dieter provided the civilian documentation, working faster than he ever had before, knowing that every hour increased the chance that Krauss's surveillance would pick up anomalies. Father Lichtenberg's network moved the 15 people out of Berlin in groups of 2 and 3, using routes that had become dangerously exposed, but were the only options remaining. Each transfer was a gamble. Each safe house was a potential trap. On the second night, 2 of the 15 were stopped at a checkpoint in Potsdam. The documents were perfect, but the guard was suspicious, called for a supervisor, began asking questions that did not have good answers. Gerstein received word an hour later. 2 people captured meant 2 people who could identify members of the network under interrogation. 2 people who knew safe house locations, travel routes, forger contacts. The mathematics changed again. Shut down the operation immediately and hope the captured 2 held out long enough for the network to disappear. Or continue moving the remaining 13 and accept that time was running out. Gerstein chose to continue. 13 more lives. 13 more people who would not die in gas chambers, because he had chosen safety over action. But the cost was becoming unsustainable. Margaret arrested. 2 escapees captured. Krauss circling closer with every hour. The network fraying at every connection point. And 447 people already loaded onto trains heading east to Auschwitz, where carbon monoxide or Zyklon B waited to end their stories in concrete chambers disguised as showers. Gerstein sat alone in his apartment at 3 a.m, a glass of schnapps in one hand and his service pistol in the other. The arithmetic played out in his mind with brutal clarity. 663 saved, thousands dead, thousands more dying every day while he saved dozens. The equation had never balanced. It never would. But the alternative was putting down the forged documents and picking up the gun in his hand and ending the intolerable burden of choosing who lived and who died based on mathematics that had no moral answer. Gerstein drank the schnapps, put down the pistol, picked up his pen. Tomorrow there would be another list, another transport, another impossible choice, and he would make it. Because some was better than none. Even when some felt like damnation, the arrest came at dawn. Hans Müller never had a chance. 6 Gestapo agents surrounded his apartment building in Schneeberg at 5:43 in the morning, blocking every exit before they kicked in his door. He was still in his nightclothes when they dragged him into the street, wrists already shackled, face already bloodied from resisting. Gerstein learned about it 90 minutes later from Father Lichtenberg, who heard it from a parishioner who lived in the same building. The priest's voice on the telephone was steady, but Gerstein could hear the terror underneath. They took everything, Lichtenberg said quietly. Papers, files, personal effects. They spent 2 hours searching before they transported him to Prince Albrechtstrasse. Our friend mentioned seeing Hauptsturmführer Krause supervising the operation personally. Gerstein set down the telephone receiver with careful precision, as if sudden movement might shatter what remained of his control. Hans Müller knew too much. Safe house locations, travel routes, the names of everyone in the network. Under Gestapo interrogation, with methods that made death seem merciful, everyone broke eventually. The mathematics were brutally simple. Gerstein had perhaps 12 hours before Müller gave up the first piece of actionable information. 24 hours before the entire network was exposed. 48 hours before Gestapo teams were kicking in doors across Berlin, arresting everyone who had ever helped forge a document or move a family to safety. And there was still one operation in progress. The Kaufmann family, 5 people including 3 children under the age of 10, were scheduled to depart from Lehrter station in 4 hours on civilian rail to Hamburg, and from there by ship to Sweden. Dieter had already delivered their forged documents. Father Lichtenberg's people had moved them to a safe house near the station. The escape route was planned down to the minute. Canceling now meant abandoning them. 5 people who had already been pulled from the deportation system, already flagged in the records as processed, already erased from the official counts. If they did not board that train, they had nowhere to go. No papers that would survive serious scrutiny. No way back into the system without triggering immediate investigation. They would be picked up within days, interrogated about how they obtained false documents, tortured until they revealed every detail of the network that had tried to save them. Or Gerstein could let the operation proceed. Get the Kaufmanns out before the network collapsed. 5 more lives saved before everything ended. But proceeding meant exposing everyone involved to capture. The safe house watchers who were guarding the family. The forger who had created their documents. The train conductor who had been bribed to look the other way. If Müller broke before the Kaufmanns were safely across the border, Krause would have the entire operation mapped in real time. The choice was impossible. Abandon 5 people to save the network, or save 5 people and guarantee the network's destruction. Gerstein picked up the telephone. Get them out, he told Father Lichtenberg. Now, everything proceeds as planned, and then you disappear. Take nothing with you that can connect you to this work. Go to your sister's convent in Bavaria, and do not contact anyone for any reason until I send word. And you? The priest asked. I have one more thing to do, Gerstein said. He hung up before Lichtenberg could argue. The thing he had to do was walk directly into Gestapo headquarters. It was insane. It was also the only move Krause would not anticipate. A guilty man would run. A guilty man would destroy evidence and scatter his accomplices and try to disappear into the chaos of wartime Germany. A guilty man would not voluntarily present himself at the center of the investigation that was hunting him, unless that man understood that his only chance of survival lay in absolute audacity. Gerstein arrived at Prince Albrechtstrasse at 10:15, precisely 30 minutes after the morning security briefing, when the building would be at its most active and chaotic. He walked through the main entrance in full SS uniform, returned salutes with mechanical precision, and went directly to Krause's office, as if he had been summoned. The Hauptsturmführer looked up from his desk with an expression of genuine surprise. Sturmbannführer Gerstein, he said slowly. "I was not expecting you." "I heard about the arrest of Hans Müller," Gerstein said, without preamble. "The train dispatcher from Grunewald Station. I thought you should know that I interviewed him 3 weeks ago as part of my investigation into transport delays affecting medical supply shipments. If he is involved in sabotage activities, there may be relevant information in my notes." It was a masterwork of misdirection, admitting contact with Muller before Krauss could discover it through interrogation, framing that contact as official business, offering to cooperate so eagerly that suspicion became difficult to maintain. Krauss studied him for a long moment. "How very helpful of you," he said finally. "Please sit. Tell me everything you discussed with Herr Müller." For the next hour, Gerstein constructed an elaborate fiction. He described interviewing Müller about railway scheduling inefficiencies that were delaying medical supply transports. He provided specific dates, times, technical details about cargo manifests and routing protocols. Every fact was verifiable, every detail plausible. The entire story was designed to place his contact with Müller in the most innocuous possible context. And all the while, behind Krauss's desk, Gerstein could see files stacked in careful piles. Documentation of the case the Gestapo had been building, evidence of patterns and inconsistencies, and 237 people who had mysteriously failed to arrive at their designated deaths. Somewhere in those files was proof of what he had done. Somewhere in Hans Müller's memory, being extracted floor by floor in the interrogation cells below this very building, were the names and methods and locations that would unravel everything. The only question was whether Gerstein could maintain his performance long enough for the Kaufmann family to cross the border. "One thing puzzles me," Krauss said, interrupting Gerstein's explanation of railway routing protocols. "You say you interviewed Müller 3 weeks ago, but I have been investigating transport irregularities for 5 months. Why did you not report your concerns about Grunewald Station earlier?" It was a trap, a small one, almost invisible, but deadly. Answer too quickly, and he would sound rehearsed. Too slowly, and he would seem to be constructing lies. "Because I did not consider them concerns," Gerstein replied evenly. Müller explained the delays as resulting from Allied bombing damage to rail infrastructure and increased military priority traffic. Both are common problems. I noted them in my records but saw no reason to escalate routine inefficiency to the Gestapo. Obviously, I was wrong. Krauss made a note. "Obviously," he agreed. "Though it is interesting that your assessment of routine inefficiency coincides so precisely with what we now know to be deliberate sabotage." The walls were closing again. Every answer Gerstein gave created new questions. Every explanation opened new avenues for investigation. He was trying to plug leaks in a dam that was already crumbling. "Hauptsturmführer," Gerstein said carefully. "If you are suggesting that I am somehow involved in Müller's activities, I would appreciate you saying so directly. I have served the Reich faithfully for years. I have done work that has cost me sleep and sanity. If my service is now being questioned based on coincidence and circumstance, I deserve to hear the accusation formally." It was a calculated risk, forcing Krauss's hand, demanding he either make a formal accusation with evidence sufficient to justify arrest, or back down and acknowledge that suspicion alone was not enough. For 10 long seconds, Krauss said nothing. Then he smiled. "I am not accusing you of anything, Sturmbannführer," he said pleasantly. "I am simply being thorough. Surely you understand." "Of course," Gerstein replied. "Is there anything else you need from me?" "Not at this time," Kraus said, "though I suspect Herr Müller will have interesting things to say once he becomes more cooperative. I may need to speak with you again, depending on what he reveals." It was a warning and a promise. Gerstein stood. "I am at your service whenever you require," he said. He left the office and walked through the corridors of Gestapo headquarters with steady steps, nodding to colleagues, his face betraying nothing of the terror screaming through his nervous system. Only when he reached the street did he check his watch. 11:47. The Kaufmann family's train departed at 1:15. 90 minutes. 90 minutes for 5 people to board a train and disappear into the flow of wartime civilian traffic. 90 minutes for Gerstein to maintain the illusion that he was an innocent officer caught up in someone else's crimes. 90 minutes before everything either worked or collapsed. He could not go to Lehrter Station. Kraus would have surveillance teams watching him now. Any deviation from normal routine would confirm suspicions. So Gerstein returned to his office at the SS Hygiene Institute and sat at his desk and pretended to work on reports while watching the clock advance with agonizing slowness. 1:15 came and went. No telephone call from Kraus, no Gestapo teams bursting through his door. Nothing but silence and the normal sounds of an office building at work. At 3:30, Gerstein allowed himself to believe that the Kaufmanns had made it out of Berlin. At 4:15, he permitted himself to hope they had reached Hamburg. At 6:42, when his direct line rang and he heard Father Lichtenberg's voice saying only, "They are across," he finally exhaled. 668. 5 more lives pulled from the machinery of death. 5 more people who would survive this war because of documents forged in darkness and risks taken by people who had every reason to choose safety over salvation. But Hans Müller was still in the interrogation cells, still being broken, piece by piece, by methods designed to extract every fragment of knowledge, still holding information that would destroy everyone who had worked with Gerstein over 18 months of operations. The clock was running, and time was running out. That night, Gerstein sat in his apartment with his service pistol on the table beside a bottle of schnapps and waited for the knock on the door that would end everything. Arrest, trial, execution, the standard progression for traitors to the Reich. But the knock did not come. Not that night, not the next day, not the day after. Hans Müller, it seemed, was holding out, refusing to break despite interrogation techniques that made death seem merciful, buying time with his silence and his suffering for the network to scatter, for evidence to be destroyed, for the people he had helped save to get further away from the reach of the Gestapo. On the 4th day, Gerstein received word through an underground contact that Müller had died during interrogation. Heart failure, the official cause. But the contact, who worked in the prison medical office, reported that Müller's body showed signs of torture so severe that death had been inevitable. He had held out for 4 days, 4 days of unimaginable pain, 4 days during which he could have ended his suffering with a single sentence revealing what he knew. He had chosen silence, chosen to die rather than betray the people who had trusted him. Gerstein attended Müller's funeral. It was a small affair, just family, and a few colleagues who had known him as a railway dispatcher, and nothing more. Kraus was there too, watching from across the cemetery, with cold eyes that promised the investigation would continue. As they lowered Muller's coffin into the ground, Father Lichtenberg, standing beside Gerstein in civilian clothes, whispered a prayer, not for the dead, for those who still lived and still fought. "Greater love hath no man than this," the priest said quietly, "that a man lay down his life for his friends." Gerstein said nothing, but he added Hans Muller's name to the ledger he carried in his memory. One more person who had paid the ultimate price for doing what was right in a world that had gone mad. One more debt he could never repay. That night, in the bakery cellar, with what remained of his network, Gerstein faced a decision that had been inevitable from the moment Margareta Klein was arrested. "We cannot continue," Dieter said. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "Not like this. Kraus is too close. One more operation, and he will have everything he needs to bring us all in." Father Lichtenberg nodded slowly. "The young man is right," he said. "We have done good work, saved hundreds, but the cost is becoming unbearable. Hans is dead. Margaret is likely dead or broken. How many more must die before we acknowledge that continuing is suicide?" Gerstein looked at the two men who remained of his once larger network. Good men, brave men, men who had risked everything and lost nearly everything. "There is a transport scheduled for day after tomorrow," he said quietly. 347 people. I have access to the list. I can identify 20 who might be saved if we move quickly and precisely. 20 more corpses when Kraus catches us, Dieter said bitterly. Because he will catch us. You know he will. Yes, Gerstein agreed. He probably will. Which means these may be the last people we can save. The last chance to pull anyone from the machinery before it consumes us along with them. The question is whether we take that chance, or whether we stop now and live with knowing we could have saved 20 more. The silence in the cellar was absolute. I am tired, Father Lichtenberg said finally. Tired of choosing who lives and who dies. Tired of pretending I am God. Tired of mathematics that have no moral answer. He met Gerstein's eyes. But I am not tired enough to abandon 20 souls to hell while I still have breath to resist. Dieter crushed his cigarette under his heel. 20, he said, and then we stop. Win or lose, success or arrest, 20 is the end. Agreed. Gerstein nodded. Agreed, he said. 20 more lives. And then the reckoning. The final operation began at midnight on April 3rd, 1944. 20 names. 20 people pulled from a transport of 347 scheduled for Auschwitz at dawn. 20 final chances to justify 18 months of forged documents and sleepless nights, and the deaths of Margareta Klein and Hans Muller. 20 souls to balance against the thousands Gerstein had failed to save. The mathematics had never been crueler. Gerstein worked alone in the records office at Prince Albrecht Strasse, his copied keys granting him access to files that would mean his execution if anyone discovered him here. Kraus's investigation had made the network too dangerous to activate. Father Lichtenberg had already fled to Bavaria. Dieter had disappeared into the communist underground 2 days ago. But Gerstein had the skills himself. 18 months of practice had made him an expert forger. He knew every stamp, every signature, every bureaucratic pathway through the machinery of death. He created the medical holds with hands that had stopped shaking months ago. Tuberculosis screening, typhus quarantine, the same false diagnoses that had saved hundreds before. His pen moved across the forms with practiced precision, every letter perfect, every detail verifiable. The stamp came down 20 times. 20 perfect forgeries. 20 lives pulled from the statistical void. And then the door opened behind him. Gerstein did not turn around. He knew who it would be. Had known since the moment he decided to attempt this final operation that the odds of success without his network were impossibly small. Sturmbannführer Gerstein, Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Krause said quietly, I confess I am disappointed. I had hoped my assessment of you was wrong. Gerstein set down his pen with care, placed his hands flat on the desk where Krause could see them. No sudden movements, no reaching for the pistol he had left in his desk drawer hours ago, knowing that this moment might come and that armed resistance would only make things worse. How long have you known? Gerstein asked. Krause moved into the room, his own sidearm drawn, but held casually at his side. Truly known? He said. Since the interrogation of Hans Müller. He held out longer than most, but everyone breaks eventually. The names he gave me, the methods he described, they all pointed to you. But I wanted to catch you in the act. Wanted proof that would stand up before any tribunal. He gestured at the forged documents on the desk. This will do nicely, he said. Gerstein looked at the 20 files spread before him. 20 people he had tried to save. 20 people who would now die because he had been caught before the documents could be processed. The final arithmetic of his failure. May I ask, Gerstein said quietly, when you began following me tonight? I have been following you for 3 weeks, Krause replied, waiting for you to make exactly this kind of mistake. After Müller died, I knew you would feel compelled to continue. Men like you cannot help yourselves. You mistake stubbornness for virtue. And what kind of man are you, Hauptsturmführer? Gerstein asked. The kind who enforces orders without questioning where they lead. The kind who sleeps well, knowing he facilitated the murder of millions. Krause's expression hardened. I am the kind of man who serves his country faithfully. Unlike you, I do not suffer from the delusion that individual conscience supersedes national duty. Your crimes are not noble resistance. They are treason. Perhaps, Gerstein agreed. But I would rather be a traitor to the Reich than a loyal servant of evil. How many? Krause asked suddenly. How many did you manage to save with your forged documents and midnight conspiracies? Gerstein met his eyes. 688, he said, though I suppose these 20 will not count. For a moment, something flickered across Krause's face. Not admiration, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgment of scale. 688 lives was not nothing. Even in the vast machinery of genocide, it was a number that mattered. Stand up, Krause ordered. You are under arrest for treason against the Reich. Gerstein stood slowly. What happens now? He asked. Interrogation, Krause said flatly. Trial, execution, the standard procedure for traitors. But the execution never came. Before Gerstein's trial could be arranged, the Reich began to collapse. The Allied armies advanced from east and west, crushing what remained of German resistance. The SS apparatus that had sustained the machinery of genocide disintegrated under the pressure of imminent defeat. On April 22, 1945, with Soviet artillery audible in the distance, Kurt Gerstein walked out of his cell in a collapsing Berlin and surrendered himself to French forces in southwestern Germany. He carried with him a detailed written account of everything he had witnessed. Belzec, the gas chambers disguised as showers, The 3,000 dead in a single morning. The systematic murder of millions. His attempts to inform the world through Swedish diplomat Baron G. Ran von Otter and others. His 18 months operating a rescue network from inside the SS. He expected to be received as a witness, perhaps even as a hero, a man who had risked everything to resist evil from within. Instead, he was arrested as a war criminal. The French authorities saw only the SS uniform, only the technical reports he had filed on Zyklon B efficiency, only his signature on documents authorizing poison gas shipments to Auschwitz. They did not see, or chose not to see, the 688 lives he had saved. Gerstein was transferred from a hotel, where he had been held under house arrest, to a jail in Constance, and then to the infamous Cherche Midi military prison in Paris. There, in a cell designed for common criminals, he wrote what became known as the Gerstein Report. It was a meticulous document, page after page of testimony describing the Holocaust in technical detail, the capacity of the gas chambers, the efficiency of the killing process, the bureaucratic systems that enabled industrial murder, and his own attempts, desperate and insufficient, to throw sand in the gears. On July 25, 1945, Kurt Gerstein was found hanged in his cell. The official verdict was suicide. A man broken by guilt and despair, unable to bear the weight of what he had witnessed and failed to prevent. But rumors persisted. Whispers that fellow SS members, imprisoned in the same facility, had murdered him for betraying secrets about the Holocaust. That the hanging had been staged to silence a witness whose testimony threatened too many powerful men. The truth died with him. 5 years later, in August 1950, a denazification tribunal in Tübingen found Gerstein to have been a Nazi offender for his assistance in the production and delivery of Zyklon B. His widow was denied a pension. The 688 lives he had saved were not mentioned in the verdict. It would take 15 more years before Baron G. Ran von Otter and other witnesses finally convinced the Federal Republic of Germany to issue a posthumous pardon. January 1965. 20 years after Gerstein's death. Justice, if it could be called justice, moved slowly. But the people Gerstein saved remembered. Rachel Weiss, pulled from a transport in March 1943 at age 7, by forged documents she did not understand until decades later. She survived the war, hidden in a Catholic orphanage. Grew up, had children, grandchildren, a family that existed only because an SS officer she never met had risked everything to save strangers. The Rosenblum family, who boarded a train to Switzerland in March 1943 and built new lives far from the ashes of Berlin. Who told their story to anyone who would listen, insisting that not everyone who wore the uniform was a monster. The Kaufmann children, who grew old enough to have their own children, and who named them after the man who had given them the chance to live. 688 people. Their descendants numbered in the thousands now. Teachers, doctors, artists, ordinary people living ordinary lives that would never have existed without Kurt Gerstein's extraordinary choice. The Gerstein Report became one of the key documents used at the Nuremberg trials. His eyewitness testimony of Belzec provided crucial evidence against high-ranking Nazi officials. It was used again in 1961 during the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, and again in 2000 during the libel trial between Holocaust denier David Irving and historian Deborah Lipstadt. His words, written in a Paris prison cell in the final weeks of his life, became a permanent record of what had happened when ordinary bureaucracy was placed in service of extraordinary evil. But the question that haunted scholars and survivors alike remained unanswered. Could participation in a criminal system ever be redeemed by resistance from within? Was saving 688 lives enough to atone for facilitating the apparatus that murdered millions? Was Kurt Gerstein a hero who did the best he could in impossible circumstances, or a collaborator whose belated conscience came too late to matter? The mathematics offered no clear answer. Some said his efforts were too little, too late, that a truly moral man would have refused to participate at all, would have died rather than serve the SS in any capacity. Others pointed to the 688, to the families that existed because of him, to the testimony he provided when the world needed witnesses, to the impossible choice he made to stay inside the machine so he could save whoever he could reach. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps Kurt Gerstein was neither saint nor villain, but something more complicated. A flawed man who made terrible compromises in service of saving lives, who carried the burden of the arithmetic that had no moral solution, who died uncertain whether what he had done mattered at all. But in a cemetery in Stockholm, there is a grave marker placed by the Rosenblum family. It bears no official designation, just a simple inscription, "For the man who gave us tomorrow." And in Jerusalem, in the archives at Yad Vashem, there is a file containing testimony from survivors, pages of handwritten accounts from people who owed their lives to forged documents and midnight risks, stories of an SS officer who chose conscience over duty, who saved whom he could, when he could, at whatever cost. 688 names, 688 stories, 688 answers to the question of whether one person can make a difference in the face of overwhelming evil. The arithmetic may never balance, the moral equation may never resolve, but those 688 lives and the thousands who came after them are Kurt Gerstein's legacy. Some is better than none, even when some feels like damnation, even when the cost is everything, even when history judges harshly and justice comes too late. Kurt Gerstein understood that arithmetic, and he chose to act anyway. That choice echoes still.